Hello. I saw that recently this really funny video about how teachers were trying to think of other things to call their students when they start recording their lessons. And I know I say, hey, friends, and hey, guys, and hey, kiddos a lot. And I don't say anything else. So I'll try to think of some interesting things to start my videos with for you in the future. But today is just Monday. So we are starting some more My Survival, a Girl on Schindler's List. And we're going to get towards the end of it this week, so it'll be really exciting. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up our presentation. Remember that all of these presentations are found in our Google Drive for our classroom. So you can always go back to them if you need to. I can't find the present button. There it is. Okay. All right, so it's week 3 if you're on our timeline. If not, that's okay, as always. It's still probably week 3 for you, or somewhere like it. All right, today is day 9, and it's Monday, April 27th, and we're going to read Chapter 8, 1944, Auschwitz. Our focus standard for today is RI 4.3. I can describe cause and effect connections in a historical text. So, like we always say, our RI is reading informational text, our 4 is for 4th grade, and we're on our 3rd informational standard this week, or today. And our I can statement. Let's go ahead and do that. Mirrors on. I can describe cause and effect connections in a historical text. Mirrors off. Okay, so we know that we're reading an informational text, and we know that for a lot of reasons. First of all, this historical piece. A historical text is going to be informational for the most part. There is a such thing as historical fiction. We've read some of it before, but you would know that you were reading fiction because this letter up here would be in L for literary. We can describe cause and effect connections in both literary and informational, but obviously our anchor text right now is informational, so we're going to stick to informational. All right, so we talked, I guess last week, maybe the week before, about connections and making connections in a text, and we talked about all the different kinds of connections. There's sequence connections, there are cause and effect connections, there are problem and solution connections. There are connections from one person to one event, and there are also comparing and contrasting connections. Cause and effect is a really, really big connection that we like to focus on because it's touched on a lot in testing, and it's really important for us to be able to understand, especially an informational text as a whole, to really understand those specific cause and effect connections. So we're going to look at cause and effect today and just talk really specifically about that. Do y'all see my face move just now? Anyway, it's kind of cool. I'm using a little bit of a new app this week so that I can upload to the classroom in a different way. Anyway, cause and effect. That's the connection that describes when one thing happens due to another thing happening. There are clue words that you can look for in a text: because, so, as a result, due to, if and then, and since. But we have to be careful with clue words because they don't always signal cause and effect relationship. And sometimes when you see them, there is no relationship there. And then sometimes you can have a cause and effect relationship without one of those signal words. So we don't want to rely heavily on them. But when we see them, that can hint to us that there might be an important connection to be made there. Okay, so cause and effect. The cause happens first. The effect happens, I say next. And the reason that I don't say second is because causes can have many effects. And also a cause So that cause can result in an effect, which can become a cause and result in another effect. So it may not always happen second, but it happens next or after the cause. Okay. And we can also think of it in terms of what questions. So a cause is why something happens, and the effect is what happens. Don't get too complicated in your thinking because it's never going to ask you just what was the cause and what was the effect, but it's going to ask you a lot of, or we're going to ask you a lot of why questions. Why did this happen? What caused this to happen? What was the effect of this? So you do have to know those cause and effect words, and you have to be able to understand that time relationship and that it was a direct cause of something else, right? The cause, I was hungry today. Well, the cause was that I didn't eat breakfast, and the effect was that I was hungry. But before I was hungry, I also put my shoes on. Just because that happened before doesn't mean that it was a cause. Putting my shoes on didn't cause me to be hungry. Those weren't related at all. So you also have to make sure that your two things that you're talking about are actually related. Make sense? Okay, today we're going to read chapter 8. And while this chapter is scary, it's one of my favorites. The place that they're going to talk about is called Auschwitz, and it's one of the most famous concentration camps of all of the Holocaust. And it's famous because it was so, so terrible. And the stories from this spot and this time in history are so, so terrible. And I guess the reason that I enjoy reading about this so much is that I have trouble understanding how this could have possibly happened. How the whole world, for way too long, and I mean, eventually they got involved, but for way too long, they allowed this just blind killing to happen. And the stories of the survivors and the people who experienced are absolutely incredible. So I really enjoy reading about this. So over here we have some pictures of Auschwitz, and we'll learn to understand more about them as we read. This was the entrance to Auschwitz, and this was some of the housing. This was the transport that they took to Auschwitz. And these are trains, but they're what we would call cattle car trains that you would transport cattle, like cows and animals in. These are some of the Jews who were working at Auschwitz and living at Auschwitz, and that's the same thing here. These were the barracks that they lived in and that they slept in, those 3-tiered bunk beds. Okay, so some of the questions that I'm going to ask and that I want you to think of as we read. What was the effect of the Nazis' need to hide their crimes as the war came to an end? What were 2 reasons that Oskar Schindler chose to go through the trouble of moving his factory to Czechoslovakia? Why did the Nazis want to take away the Jews' feelings of identity? What caused the Hungarian women to beat the Jews in the barracks? What other cause and effect relationships can you identify? So these are all questions that assess cause and effect connections. These are all asking you about a cause or an effect or 2 causes or 2 effects. And then this one's asking you, okay, I asked you about a bunch of cause and effect relationships. What else can you identify yourself from this chapter? And then the quote that we are going to have stick with us today is, that moment was the first time I felt like I was losing my identity. I didn't feel like myself anymore. So we've talked a little bit about cultural identity in social studies. And my students definitely understand identity because we talk a lot about deaf identity, and that can be a part of you. Your identity is what you believe makes you you. And it can be a lot of different things. And it's definitely your choice and your opinion of yourself that creates your identity. Me, I would identify as being a teacher, for one. I identify as being someone who grew up in New Orleans. That's a part of my identity. And I identify with helping others. I identify with like fundraising and philanthropy. Those are things that kind of make up my identity. Um, and your identity can be made up of a lot of things. So we'll talk more about that later. But that's an important thing that we want to just kind of realize, is that the Germans were really about to take away, or they were working on taking away, the identity of the Jews. And that's crazy. Okay. I was trying to make this, perfect, so that you can see my beautiful face a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to leave this in presentation mode, and then I'm going to read from here. And if this is not big enough for you guys, just let me know. And next chapter, I'll make sure I make myself a little bit bigger. Come on. I don't want it to be too distracting for you. Okay, let's do that this way. All right? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and read Chapter 8, 1944, Auschwitz. By summer of 1944, Nazi Germany was starting to lose the war, thanks to constant attacks by American and British forces from the west and Soviet Russian forces from the east. The Germans knew that soon they would be held accountable for the torture and murders committed inside camps. To hide their crimes, they began closing smaller camps such as Plaszow, or Poissuf, and deporting prisoners to camps west inside Germany. Even though we worked for Oscar, we were still slaves of the Poissuf administrators, who put us to work helping close down the camp. Some of us were ordered to pack up stolen goods for shipment to Nazi headquarters in Berlin. These included gold watches, jewelry, silverware, paintings, and other possessions stolen from Jews. We placed these valuables in wooden crates, nailed the crates shut, and loaded them onto trucks and trains. We watched in terror as the Jews from Poissuf were loaded onto trucks and trains and sent off to be killed. To give you an idea of how many were murdered, before the Germans closed the Poissuf camp, there were about 18,000 women prisoners. After they closed the camp, fewer than 2,000 women prisoners remained, including me and my mother. So they killed about 16,000 Jews. Just in that camp, just in that one small area of that big map that we saw. Oscar worried that his factory would be closed and his Jewish workers deported along with other prisoners to camps in Germany. Then he had an idea. It was risky, but he had always taken chances, and fortune often had been on his side. His idea was to dismantle the entire factory, equipment, machines, and supplies, load everything into boxcars, and relocate Amalia from Krakow, Poland, to Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia, which is now called Brnik, I don't know how to pronounce that, in the Czech Republic. There, near the town where he was born, he would reconstruct his factory and continue manufacturing ammunition. It took a lot of money to do this, because he had to bribe dozens of officials with expensive gifts to get the permits needed for such a move. But he succeeded. Why did he go to so much trouble? One reason may have been selfish. He hoped that after the war, he could rebuild his business in Czechoslovakia and continue making money. But another reason was unselfish. He knew the Nazis planned to murder as many Jews as possible before the Allies, meaning the American, British, and Russian armies, arrived. By relocating his factory, he hoped he could also relocate his Jewish workers and save their lives. But even someone as influential as Oskar Schindler could not save us from all the horrors of the Holocaust, especially the terror known as Auschwitz. In October 1944, guards marched me, my mother, and the other Schindler women to a train station and shoved us into boxcars. Guards shut the big wooden doors and the train left the station. There was no water, food, bathroom, or windows, or even much oxygen, but we believed the train was taking us to Oscar's new factory in Czechoslovakia, so we tolerated the overcrowding, hunger, and foul smells as best we could. After several hours, the train stopped. It was late at night. The doors opened, and a blinding spotlight hit our eyes. When our sight adjusted, we saw barbed wire fences stretching in both directions. There was a terrible stench, like rotting meat. German soldiers stood before us with rifles and dogs. I looked up and saw a sign that read, Auschwitz-Birkenau. We had heard rumors about this place. It was said to be a killing center where Jews were murdered in gas chambers and their bodies burned in crematoria ovens. There must be a mistake, we told ourselves. We worked for Oskar Schindler. Why were we in Auschwitz? Everyone off the train, guards yelled. Ross, quickly! The guards beat us with whips and made us jump down onto the arrival platform. White flakes like snow were falling all around us. We were thirsty after traveling so long without water and stuck out our tongues to catch the flakes. But they didn't taste like snow. We looked up and realized the flakes were falling from the tall chimneys above the crematoria ovens. White ashes. Human ashes. My mother and I watched a German officer sort us into groups of those who were physically healthy and those who were not. He sent the strong women to the right and the weak or sickly women to the left. To make ourselves look healthier, we copied other women around us and pinched our cheeks until they were rosy. When our turn came, the guard looked us over and sent us to the right. We learned that the weaker people in the left line went immediately to die in the gas chambers. Guards marched our group inside a barrack and told us to strip naked. We stood huddled together, shivering. What happened next was humiliating. Male prisoners wearing striped uniforms used rusty scissors and razor blades to shave off all our hair. The equipment was old and dull and tugged painfully on our hair, and many of us began to cry. When I was little, I had beautiful, thick braids. In the Krakow ghetto, my mother had cut my hair short so it would be easier to keep clean. But a shaved head? That moment was the first time I felt as if I was losing my identity. I didn't feel like myself anymore. The women around me huddled together and shook like leaves from cold and fear. I thought, who can look like this and still be alive? I stared up at the woman next to me and could hardly believe this bald person was my mother. The guards pushed us into a dark room, yelling, Poissouf, scum! We shouldn't be wasting our time with you. I looked up and noticed metal pipes with small holes crisscrossing the ceiling. We had no idea where we were or what this room was. We had heard about rumors of people dying in gas chambers, but who could believe such a nightmare? We had no idea what would happen to us. All at once, something came out of the pipes and we held our breath. It was water. We weren't going to die that day. The cold shower ended and women guards chased us out of the room with sticks. They pointed to piles of wooden shoes and ordered us to take one pair each. Then they pointed to a pile of clothes and yelled again to quickly get dressed. People grabbed whatever they could put their hands on. I saw a yellow dress with red flowers and tried to put it on, but it was huge, made for a heavy, tall woman, not a skinny 15-year-old. I tied the dress around my waist as best as I could. Then they pushed us outside. This was late autumn 1944. The weather was cold and it had been raining. Guards marched us down a muddy road and into a barack where we collapsed on wooden bunks covered with a thin layer of smelly straw. There wasn't enough room for everyone, so some of the women lay down on the stone floor. The women in charge of our barracks were Hungarian. We didn't speak their language. Because we had no idea what they were saying, they would beat us for not obeying instructions. How did it feel to be yelled at in a foreign language, beaten with sticks, and not know what we were supposed to do? How did it feel to be starving and not knowing if we were going to live one more day? How did it feel to be surrounded by prisoners who looked more dead than alive? It felt like the Nazis had taken away my soul. Okay. Very sad chapter. Don't worry, her story gets better. But important, right? So think about some of those cause and effect connections. Go back and think about those questions. Our next quiz comes out after chapter 9, and I'll ask you all these questions in there, okay? So think about if you can make those connections. Think if you can make another cause and effect connection. Comment on this video. Comment on this assignment, on this piece of material in our Google Classroom, and let me know what you think. All right, kiddos. Love you, miss you, and mean it. Let's see if I can figure out how to end this. And stop. Nope, don't hide tools.